What would it take to break an enemy who had already swallowed most of a continent? Not merely to beat them in battle, but to crush their spirit so utterly that seasoned veterans men who had marched through Poland and France and driven deep into Russia would later confess they had never witnessed anything like it. What follows is the explanation: a weapon system so ruthlessly effective it reshaped modern combat, yet one that sits, curiously, outside the public's usual account of the war. I mean, American artillery in World War II, the whole apparatus of fire control, communications, and industrial production that turned the U.S. field artillery into what German commanders would quietly call the deadliest presence on any battlefield. Picture this: dozens of guns manned by young Americans, many of them farm boys who had never seen a cannon before 1942, moving, calculating, and firing in a choreography so exact that it functioned like a symphony of destruction. Imagine the relief among infantrymen when that thunder rolled in, the way entire enemy positions could be sterilized within minutes. What you're about to read is a story of necessity breeding invention, of mathematics married to mass production, of the moment when America's industrial heart expressed itself in a terrible, decisive language on the fields of France and the shattered towns of Germany. Let us move the calendar to the spring of 1944. As Allied commanders readied the liberation of Europe, a stark truth confronted them. Across the front sat the Wehrmacht, the most experienced, the most battle-hardened military force then on earth. German soldiers had been fighting for 5 years. They had honed combined arms tactics to a fine edge. Their non-commissioned officers and officers had survived campaigns spanning an entire continent. To them, the Allied formations often looked like amateur citizen soldiers thrown into the maw of total war. The Germans trusted in their artillery. They boasted fearsome pieces, among them the legendary 80-meter gun that could send a shell with the providence to unmake any Allied tank in the path. Their forward observers were aggressive and subtle. Their discipline in fire was exacting. When a German battery opened its voice, it spoke with economy. Each projectile aimed, every mission scaled to extract maximum effect while conserving ammunition. Precision and conservation were their watchwords. The Americans arrived with another gospel. Where German doctrine prized meticulous calculation and thrift, American thinking emphasized weight of fire and tempo. Where German planners measured and economized, American planners sought to overwhelm. That contrast was not mere bravado. It was the seed of a revolution in the employment of artillery, a transformation so thorough that it altered the conduct of war itself. But here is the nuance that typical histories sometimes miss. The triumph was not just a matter of more guns or a deeper magazine, though America had both in abundance. It was the emergence of a new system. Artillery ceased to be a collection of isolated batteries and became, instead, a networked instrument, an orchestra where separate units could be massed, guided, and synchronized so that the fires of dozens of guns dispersed over miles could be poured on a single point within minutes. The Germans possessed no counterpart to this scale of coordinated burning. No army before had marshaled artillery with such concentrated, devastating unity. To understand how this came about, we must go back, not to the hedgerows of Normandy, but to the open plains of Oklahoma and the ranges of Fort Sill. Between the wars, in those proving grounds, the U.S. Field Artillery School labored quietly and stubbornly to reshape its art. During the years when isolationist sentiment kept the United States away from the continental conflagration until 1941, a handful of forward-looking American artillery officers read the signs. They sifted the reports from Spain, studied the fighting in China, and parsed the early campaigns in Europe, learning, adapting, discarding what failed, keeping what endured. So ask yourself, standing on that training ground, watching maps and test shots and the slow accretion of doctrine, could anyone have imagined how those lessons would be scaled into an instrument that would, within 2 years, make old certainties of battlefield supremacy tremble? What began as patient study and tinkering at Fort Sill would, in the crucible of 1944, become a force that not only supported assaults, but dictated the tempo of battle, saving countless Allied lives and hastening the fall of a regime that had once seemed unstoppable. They had discovered a fundamental flaw in existing artillery doctrine. Traditionally, a forward observer would radio back only to their own battery, which would then calculate the firing solution and engage the target. If more firepower was needed, the request had to climb the rigid hierarchical chain to other batteries. The result was slow, cumbersome, and inflexible. By the time reinforcements arrived, the target had often moved, or the battlefield itself had shifted. A visionary group of officers, including men like General Leslie McNair, dared to imagine a radically different approach. What if any forward observer could call in fire from any available battery anywhere? What if batteries were not isolated, but organized into battalions, battalions into groups, groups into divisions, each capable of instantaneously concentrating its fires on a single point? What if artillery, rather than being parceled out piecemeal to support individual infantry units, operated as a single, responsive, and terrifyingly efficient weapon system? Unsurprisingly, the idea met fierce resistance. Traditional artillerymen scoffed, insisting it could never be coordinated. Infantry officers fretted that they would lose their precious guns. The logistics alone seemed nightmarish. Yet the reformers pressed on, and by the time America entered the war in 1941, the Field Artillery School had laid the doctrinal groundwork for what would become the deadliest artillery system in history. The young men chosen to operate this system came from every corner of the United States farms in Iowa, factories in Michigan, small towns scattered across Texas and Georgia. Most had never even seen a 105mm howitzer before basic training. They learned to calculate firing solutions using slide rules and paper charts, memorized radio protocols and forward observer procedures, and endured the punishing heat of American summers. Training forged them into teams where every man's action mattered, every second counted. The brilliance of American artillery doctrine rested on 3 revolutionary concepts which, when combined, produced an effect far greater than the sum of its parts. The first was the time on target, or TOT, fire mission. Instead of shells arriving one after another, as each battery fired in turn, TOT missions were calculated so that multiple batteries, firing from different positions at different moments, could deliver their shells simultaneously on the target. Picture yourself as a German soldier dug in along a defensive line. You hear the familiar whistle of incoming artillery, not unusual. But suddenly, instead of a few explosions spaced out over time, the world detonates all at once. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of shells slam down in a single, instantaneous eruption. There is no warning, no time to dive for cover. One moment, you are in your fighting position. The next, it and everything around it has vanished. German veterans who survived these tow barrages recalled them as psychologically shattering. They were accustomed to artillery duels, to predictable patterns of fire, but American TOT strikes obliterated any sense of safety. Every position was vulnerable. Cover was an illusion. The Americans had the terrifying power to erase any point on the map at will. The second revolutionary innovation was communications. The Americans deployed a network of radios that, primitive by modern standards, was still far ahead of anything else in the war. Forward observers, embedded with frontline infantry, could speak directly to fire direction centers, FDCs, located miles behind the lines. These centers, staffed with specialists and equipped with calculating tools, could compute firing solutions and coordinate multiple batteries within minutes. Even more potent was the Fire's Net, a system that allowed any battery not currently engaged to be assigned to any mission, regardless of which unit nominally controlled it. In effect, the entire artillery corps could act as a single, unified instrument of destruction, responsive to every call from the battlefield. The Germans had never encountered anything like it, and they would come to fear it deeply. Imagine a company of infantry pinned in a hedgerow or shell-cratered orchard. What help might they expect? Not merely the slim lifeline of their battalion's guns, but potentially the concentrated wrath of every artillery piece within reach. A single call for fire could summon one battery, or it could bring 10 batteries from 3 different divisions crashing down on the same patch of earth. The system was designed to be elastic, redundant, and blisteringly quick. The third pillar of the American approach was simple and brutal. American industry supplied the calculus. U.S. factories churned out shells by the millions, quantities that made the German practice of tight rationing look archaic. Where a German battery conserved rounds each mission, trimmed to the minimum necessary, the American calculation ran on a different logic. Need a position suppressed? Don't fire 10 carefully aimed shells. Saturate the zone with 100. Make the ground a lottery of survival. To the Americans, this did not read as waste. It read as thrift in the only currency that truly mattered on the battlefield, the lives of their soldiers. Why send infantry against a dug-in enemy when you could obliterate that enemy from a standoff and walk into the ruins? The blunt formula that emerged in Europe was artillery first, infantry second, pummel the target until it was rubble, then seize what remained. When American forces hit the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the German Corps initially treated U.S. artillery with a degree of condescension. Early German after-action reports from those first weeks note almost proudly that American fires appeared uncoordinated, that individual batteries were slow compared with German guns, and that American forward observers were inexperienced and could be suppressed. That confidence, however, evaporated in roughly 3 weeks. As American units pushed inland and the artillery battalions unrolled their doctrine, German commanders began recording something they found astonishing. They were facing what seemed like an impossible density of guns. A German company might call for support against an American foothold, and before his own batteries could reply, counter-battery strikes would smash his gun positions with uncanny precision. German officers wrote that American artillery was everywhere at once. Concentrations formed with shocking rapidity, and rear areas previously thought safe were suddenly lethal. What the Germans were encountering was the American Fire Direction Center system running at full speed. Coupled to it was American counter-battery radar A technological edge that could trace the arc of an incoming German shell back to the gun that fired it. Within minutes, those coordinates moved to the FDC, firing solutions were produced, and multiple batteries opened up. The result, the German piece that had dared to fire was frequently destroyed before its crew could limber up and execute the displacement that German doctrine demanded. The American response was simply too swift. The traditional refuge of shoot and scoot often no longer existed. And when you examine the record, the figures make the point with merciless clarity. Imagine December 1944, deep in the Ardennes, as the Battle of the Bulge unfolds, the last desperate German offensive of the war. In the first 3 days alone, American artillery hurled over 500,000 shells onto the battlefield. To put that in perspective, it was more than the entire German artillery force in the Ardennes possessed. American batteries were firing at rates that German planners had long deemed physically impossible to sustain. Barrels wore out and were swapped. Ammunition trucks formed unbroken convoys, ferrying shells from supply depots to the front lines. Ingenious gunners poured water over overheated barrels, cooling them fast enough to maintain firing rates that exceeded the manufacturer's own specifications. German commanders, many hardened by the brutal artillery barrages of the Eastern Front, reported that American fire was worse than anything they had faced in Russia. Not because Americans simply fired more shells, though often they did, but because their fire was precise, instantaneous, and seemingly inexhaustible. Soviet artillery would give away its presence with ranging shots, allowing defenders precious seconds to seek cover. American time-on-target missions offered no such warning. Soviet batteries, once their barrage ended, could regroup, reposition, and resupply. American guns never stopped. Yet there is a moral dimension that cannot be ignored. For all its technological brilliance and tactical effectiveness, the American artillery system was, at its core, a tool for industrial-scale killing. And we honor the soldiers who operated it, trained, disciplined, courageous, but we must also confront what it represented: the mechanization of death, the reduction of combat to mathematics and logistics. The men under fire were not caricatures of evil. Many German soldiers were conscripts, serving a regime they may not have chosen, fighting because refusal meant death for themselves or their families. American shells did not discriminate between fervent Nazis and reluctant draftees, between war criminals and ordinary boys from Munich hoping to survive and go home. Forward observers themselves often spoke of the psychological burden of their work. They would call in fire, watch through binoculars as positions vanished in smoke and flame, adjust the aim, and call in more shells. This was not face-to-face combat. It was abstract, distant, almost clinical. Coordinates read from a map over a radio meant dozens of men would die. And yet, consider the alternative. Every German position destroyed by artillery was a position that American infantry didn't have to storm. Every battery silenced by counter-battery fire was a battery that would not mow down American soldiers. Grim as it sounds, the mathematics of war suggested that overwhelming artillery was paradoxically the more humane option, humane for Americans, and perhaps even for Germans, since positions erased by artillery offered a chance for surrender that infantry assaults often denied. Contrast this with the British approach. Allied partners throughout the war, the British favored careful, deliberate artillery plans, often coordinated days in advance. Their barrages could be devastating, but they lacked the flexibility, responsiveness, and instantaneous coordination that made the American artillery system a force unlike any the world had ever seen. Imagine the tension between two Allied armies, each shaped by different experiences of war. British commanders often criticized American extravagance with shells, calling it wasteful, a sign of poor fire discipline. The Americans shrugged because they were fighting a very different kind of war. The British, after years of grinding attritional combat, were running short on manpower. Every casualty was painfully hard to replace. Their artillery reflected that reality, precise, calculated, cautious. Americans, with a larger population and industrial machines still ramping up, could afford prodigality if it meant saving the lives of their soldiers. The contrast between British precision and American volume raises deeper questions about how democracies wage war. What costs are acceptable, and how should efficiency be measured? By shells spent or by lives preserved? By March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and surged into Germany's heart, U.S. field artillery had reached the pinnacle of its power. Fire direction centers now coordinated not dozens but hundreds of batteries. Communications, honed over months of combat, functioned with near-perfect reliability. Forward observers, battle-hardened veterans, read terrain and predicted enemy positions with uncanny skill. German defenders, by this point, feared American artillery above all else. Their tactical manuals, issued late in the war, instructed them to disperse, keep moving, avoid concentration, because any stationary unit would inevitably be detected and obliterated. German commanders reported that American fire made almost all defensive operations nearly impossible. Forces could not mass for counterattacks without being struck. Supply points could not be established safely. Defensive positions offered no refuge from relentless bombardment. The numbers themselves are staggering. Over the course of the war in Europe, American artillery fired more than 23 million shells. Factories produced them faster than gunners could fire. What had been a theoretical system in 1941 had, by 1945, become a flawlessly functioning machine of destruction that no enemy could match or counter. Perhaps the most telling tribute comes from the Germans themselves. After the war, when historians interviewed captured officers and enlisted men about what they feared most in Allied forces, the answer was nearly unanimous. American artillery. Not tanks, not air power, not even the sheer numbers of U.S. troops. It was the guns that never seemed to run dry, that struck without warning, that turned defensive positions into moonscapes, that made every moment a struggle to survive against an enemy capable of killing from beyond the horizon. Those young American gunners, the farm boys from Iowa, the factory workers from Michigan, the small-town kids from Texas, had become the deadliest artillerymen in history. They had taken a system born in the classrooms of Fort Sill and the proving grounds of Oklahoma and forged it in the crucible of combat into a weapon that changed warfare itself. Every modern artillery doctrine in NATO armies today traces directly back to what these soldiers perfected in the fields and forests of France and Germany, and they did it without seeking glory. Most artillery operations unfolded miles behind the front, witnessed only by the crews themselves and the men on the receiving end. They did it because it was their mission, because infantry buddies counted on them, because someone had to perform the difficult, dangerous, necessary work of war. The Germans had laughed during those first weeks after Normandy, mocking what they saw as inexperienced amateurs, overarmed but unskilled. They could not have imagined the transformation that was coming, the emergence of an American artillery force that would not just support the infantry, but dominate the battlefield itself and leave an enduring mark on military history. In the months that followed, they discovered a harsh truth. War was not always about individual skill, nor about heroics in the mud and blood of the front. It was about systems, about networks and coordination. It was about collective effectiveness, not personal glory. It was about fighting smarter, not simply harder. And above all, they learned the ultimate lesson of American artillery. Once the shells began to fall, they never, ever stopped.